Ready for you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Nazik Hatasha, Policy Affairs Manager at the League of Women Voters of Ohio. We have over 100 people registered for this webinar, so we're just going to give a minute or two for everybody to file into the room. As you are coming into the room, we would love for you to say hello in the chat. If you're a member of the league, let us know what local league you're from, or if you're not, just let us know what part of Ohio you're from, and we'll get started as soon as the room populates.
Mandy, this is one of our favorite things to do, is just to look at the folks from around the state. So we've got Kent, Bowling Green, Oxford, Oberlin, Lake County, Akron, Loveland, Cincinnati, every corner, Dayton, Canton.
That's really cool to see the kind of statewide turnout.
Yeah, Cincinnati, Lakewood, Bay Village, Toledo, Lucas, Cleveland, more Dayton, Licking County, Tip City. Oh, hi, Tip City.
I feel like I'm seeing some new places today.
Cleveland Heights.
We are very fortunate to have members from every corner of the state. Just the other day, Jen reminded me that we have folks in, I think it was 92 out of the 99 state districts in Ohio. So
94. So
94, thank you.
every 100% of congressional districts, 100% of state Senate districts, and all but 5 of state House districts.
So good job, leaguers. So we are at 12:03 and I am going to get things rolling. Again, welcome everyone. We are very excited to start lunching with the league again in 2022. We have a wonderful guest with us today that I'm going to introduce in a minute. Just some general housekeeping first. As you may know, there is a chat section and there is a Q&A section. Feel free to politely correspond with each other and ask us general league questions if you'd like in the chat. If you have questions for our guest, Amanda Zoch, please make sure to put them in the Q&A so that we do not miss them. Also, I'm very excited to mention that today is the 102nd birthday of the National League of Women Voters. So happy birthday really to all of us, in addition to happy Valentine's Day. As our admin person, Alice, just mentioned, we love democracy. So it's very fitting to have Mandy on with us today. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Our guest, Amanda Zoch, is the Elections Project Manager at the National Conference of State Legislatures, where she works on policy areas relating to election administration, citizen initiatives, and more. She was previously a Mellon ACLS Public Fellow in NCSL's Election and Redistricting Program. Prior to joining NCSL, she taught college English for 6 years and received her PhD from Indiana University in 2018. Mandy, we are so excited to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here, Nazik. I am going to share my screen and I think it should be there for you all now. If it's not, someone shout and let me know. I think we're good. So Like Nazik said, I work in the elections program at NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures. And our primary goal at NCSL is to provide nonpartisan research to legislators and legislative staff throughout the states and the territories. So we provide kind of 50 state plus territory surveys of particular election policies. We publish articles and newsletters on our website. We testify before election committees in state legislatures. And we are a resource for legislators and staff for any questions that they have. So we don't take positions on policy, but we do strive to know the national landscape, right? How many states and territories have X policy, and to be the go-to information source for those legislators and legislative staff. But we also have a very robust website, and those resources, and as much as we can, we make publicly available so that groups like you and just the individual public can have access to that same information. So today, my plan is to provide an overview of last year's election legislation across the states. There was a lot. I won't talk about every single one of the bills. You'd get very bored. But I will then end with time for plenty of time for questions. So I want to start with some broader context for last year's election legislation. And the first graph here shows the number of election bills introduced in state legislatures. And then the second graph on the right shows the number of enactments. And so there were over 3,600 introductions last year. And that's a record, at least since we began tracking in 2001. And we feel fairly confident that there were no years prior to that with as many election-related bills. What's not a record, though, and to keep things in perspective, is the number of enactments, the number of bills that were passed. So there were 292 last year, and that total is actually quite a bit lower than 2019, but it really is in line with most previous years. So what this all means is that even though interest in elections has increased, that additional interest hasn't translated into more new laws being passed. But instead, the laws that did pass, as I'm sure we're all aware, did so under a spotlight. And those laws also started to take up issues that previously had garnered little attention in the mainstream media. Things like election officials and the nuances of how elections get run as opposed to how voters can access the ballot. It's worth noting too that some of the laws that passed last year were really big omnibus bills that made a lot of changes all across the state's election code. So the number of bills that passed aren't necessarily a perfect indicator of all the changes that happened. So I also want to state the obvious, which is that elections came under the legislative spotlight for two main reasons: the 2020 presidential race and the COVID-19 pandemic. So on this chart, which I've taken from the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, you can see that both early in-person voting and absentee mail voting had been increasing, with election day voting decreasing over a 20-year period starting from 1996 until 2016. It's kind of a gradual progression upward for early in-person voting and absentee or mail voting, and downward for election day voting. The trend toward mail voting, which absentee voting, mail voting, we use those interchangeably, though they're slightly different. That trend went up very steeply in 2020 because many voters chose and many states encouraged more mail voting options. So while absentee and mail voting became a really big issue in the press and in politics last year, it's been a growing trend for some time, and election day voting has similarly been decreasing in popularity. So my goal here is to provide, like I said, the national landscape of what happened to elections from the legislative perspective last year. And I'll kind of start by walking through the voter experience. So start with registration, how they vote, and then move into a bunch of other topics that don't quite fit that nice chronological trend. So when it comes to registration, there were a handful of enactments relating to how and when eligible voters can register. But I wouldn't say that there was really a full trend on this topic last year. So automatic voter registration saw the most action. A handful of states either updated or expanded their existing programs. So California and Nevada did that. And then the biggest news was that Delaware enacted full automatic voter registration. They'd kind of been trending in that way for a while. And so now 21 states and Washington, D.C. have an automatic voter registration process where voters get automatically registered when they're interacting with state agencies, most typically the DMV. In the Northeast, Maine also made a big change and passed online voter registration. So it's now the 42nd state to offer that. And that number does include Ohio. So this is when voters can register online. And then also notable was Montana repealing Election Day registration. So now 18 states allow voters to register and cast their ballots on Election Day. And in Montana, that used to be the case, but they've changed it. So now the deadline to register is the day before Election Day. In Montana and a couple other states, including all of these Election Day registration states, you can still register and vote on an early in-person day at the same time. And then Virginia will permit 16-year-olds to pre-register to vote. That's allowed in 15 states and DC. Now moving on to voter ID, much more of a hot topic than voter registration. So this is kind of the next policy choice that a lot of voters encounter, right? You show up at the polls, you have to provide some identification potentially. So action here over the past few years had really been down. It was really a big trend in the early 2000s. But in 2021, this came roaring back because Wyoming enacted the state's very first voter ID law. And that brings the total of states with voter ID laws to 35, and that includes Ohio. Arkansas and Montana also took steps to make their voter ID laws more strict. And I will say that we use the word voter ID. That doesn't always mean it's a photo ID. It doesn't always mean that there's not a kind of backup option if the voter doesn't have that ID with them. Sometimes voters can cast a provisional ballot, come back with additional identification later on. Our webpage on this is quite robust, and you can see that we kind of differentiate between strict and non-strict, photo and non-photo, if you're looking for kind of more granular information. And then of course, states that don't have voter ID laws will verify a voter's identity through other means. And we also have an online resource on that. Unsurprisingly, it was a hot topic last year. So another topic that got a lot of attention this year, much less controversial, was early in-person voting. So in a big bipartisan effort, Kentucky added 3 days of early in-person voting for the very first time. And that means that now 44 states offer early in-person voting. We saw a couple other states make adjustments here. So Indiana, Louisiana, and Oklahoma all extended the number of early voting days that they offer. Iowa decreased the number of days, and that went from 29 to 20, though I'll add that 20 early in-person voting days is about average for the nation. And then Georgia standardized the number of days across the state. So some states also took steps to limit the types of early in-person voting offered. We typically think of this as going into the polls or a polling-like place just on a day that's not election day. But there are kind of some variations on that exist. So Texas prohibited most overnight voting and drive-through voting, and Georgia limited the use of mobile voting centers to emergencies only. So unsurprisingly, absentee and mail voting was perhaps the biggest topic of last year when it comes to elections. So NCSL defines all mail elections as those where registered voters automatically receive a ballot in the mail. And prior to 2021, 5 states used all mail elections, and they're in green on this map. And then in 2021, 3 states added it, so they have the borders around them. So those are California, Nevada, and Vermont. So now we see a total of 8 states running elections primarily by mail, though they all retain some in-person voting options for those who either need it or just simply prefer it. The dark blue states on this map then are the ones with no excuse absentee voting, where a voter can request an absentee or mail ballot without needing to provide an excuse, which is the case in Ohio. We didn't actually see any states add no excuse absentee voting last year or repeal it. There was an attempt to add it in New York that went to voters because it had to be a constitutional change, and that failed in November. So again, no states added or removed that provision. but we did see states moving from no excuse absentee voting to all mail, and it tends to kind of work on a continuum like that if states are pursuing more mail voting options. Let's see here. Okay. All right, so even though no states kind of drastically limited access to absentee voting, and we just saw those 3 states really expand it, many states did turn their attention to fine-tuning absentee and mail voting processes. And so we saw a lot of legislation making kind of smaller changes that a voter might not even necessarily realize most of the time. So at least 15 states before 2021 had online absentee ballot request portals. And last year, the big news was that Kentucky and New York passed legislation establishing one, which will make it easier for voters to request their ballots. And some states can establish those absentee ballot request portals online without legislation. It just kind of depends on how things work in your state. And I did say that some of these don't affect voters, but that one certainly something that voters would encounter. Several enactments also addressed when ballots must be returned. So the most common deadline for an absentee ballot to be returned is Election Day. And that's the case in 35 states. New York in 2021 moved its return deadline from the day before Election Day to Election Day. So most states don't accept a ballot if it arrives by mail after Election Day, but there are 16 that will if the returned ballot was postmarked on or prior to Election Day. And I believe that includes Ohio. So there were 2 changes. Good, I'm seeing Nozick nod. And there were 2 changes in this area last year going in opposite directions. So my numbers stayed the same. Iowa removed its postmark by provision. So now their ballots need to arrive by Election Day, and Oregon created one. So now voters in Oregon can mail their ballot before Election Day, but if it arrives later, it can still be counted. And usually there's kind of a time window. So if it arrives, 20 days after Election Day, that's usually too far. And then I'll add that at least 6 states make exceptions for military and overseas voters whose ballots must travel much further distances. And these laws typically give an additional 7 to 10 days for a ballot to arrive and be counted as long as it has been postmarked by Election Day. So now on to ballot collection and drop boxes. So some more kind of hot topics here. Ballot collection, also sometimes known as ballot harvesting. This was a contentious issue even before 2020, and it concerns who can return a ballot other than the voter themselves. So with the recent increase in absentee and mail voting in 2020 and 2021, we'll see what happens in 2022. This issue was on the forefront of a lot of legislators' minds. And most states specify some kind of limit to ballot collection, either in terms of the number of ballots that can be returned by someone other than the voter, or who can return someone else's ballot. So most states, when they make restrictions, make it so that only a family or household member or caregiver can return someone else's ballot. And this year we saw 3 states make their ballot collection laws more strict. Ballot drop boxes were not much of a legislative issue until recently. So before 2020, only 8 states made mention of drop boxes in statute at all. And those statutes almost entirely addressed security features, right? Make sure that you can't move the drop box out of the post that it's in outside the government building or something like that. But in 2021, we saw at least 9 states enact bills relating to these drop boxes. And many of these address security, right? Like 24-hour cameras, ensuring that they're locked. But for the first time, we were also seeing enactments about how many drop boxes are required or permitted, where they should or can or cannot be located. So we're seeing kind of more legislative attention here, where previously sometimes this was left up to the discretion of local election officials. So a trend toward more uniformity potentially with ballot drop boxes. Now, at least 35 states have ballot tracking systems. So this is when you can know where your ballot is in its life cycle. Some of these are established in law, some are established without it. Again, it depends on the state. And these systems help help us, I say us as voters, but also election officials know where these ballots are. And that can mean greater peace of mind for the voter. Did my ballot actually make it there in time? And greater efficiency for election officials. So we saw 4 states in 2021 pass legislation establishing their own ballot tracking systems. And those were, not Ohio, I almost said that, Iowa, New York, Texas, and Utah. And I like to point out here that even though we see a lot of different election policies become flashpoints for partisan disagreement, there are some, like these tracking systems, that have been embraced by red and blue states alike. And then another one of those bipartisan issues is ballot cure processes, or establishing them. So we saw this find support in both Democrat and Republican-led states in 2021. So in states that have ballot cure processes, if the election officials or poll workers find that there was an issue with a signature, or a signature is missing or doesn't match on that returned absentee or mail ballot, it gives voters an opportunity to fix those errors. They can also be a fraud detection process as well. You can identify if someone other than the voter has signed a ballot, and then go to the voter and say, did you sign this? If they say no, good, you're stopping that ballot from being counted. If they say, no, I broke my arm and my signature is just kind of wonky, then you know, and it can move forward and be counted. So before 2021, 18 states, including Ohio, provided voters a chance to cure their ballots. And then last year, we saw 5 states enact cure processes. So Indiana, Kentucky, Texas, Virginia, and Vermont. And that brings the total to 23. So about half the states will have this now. And that's kind of all I have to say about the voter side of elections. I thought next I would move into this almost cornucopia of other topics that don't fit into a neat little bucket, but were big deals last year in the news and continue to be this year. So the first one is about money, prohibiting private or charitable funding for elections. So before 2020, no organizations were making gifts, grants, or contributions of any kind to election offices, and COVID changed that. Right, so the Center for Tech and Civic Life had money provided by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, and they created COVID-19 response grants. And jurisdictions all across the country could apply for these, and some states reacted to that process, including Ohio. So in 2020, we saw 11 states pass bills limiting or prohibiting the use of private or philanthropic funding to run elections. And this was all over the news. And I will just say that it's very rare that we see 11 states make the same policy choice in the same year. And this year already, we're seeing a couple states introduce similar bills. So we'll see if there are more that will be added to that number, or if there are any other kind of trends relating to funding elections, since 2020 kind of revealed the need for more funding and more consistent funding. So I've also kind of buried the lead, I think, which is that part of what was really new and different last year was the increased focus on election officials. We know that many faced harassment and an unwelcome spotlight in 2020 and 2021. We will see if that continues in 2022. And some of that attention really translated into legislation. So a handful of states created new penalties for local election officials. And I mean, firing an official who doesn't follow state law has always been an option, but now 4 states have gotten more specific. Mis and disinformation, especially that seem to be coming from local election officials or even state election officials, was a big issue that they were dealing with as well. And so Arizona, Kansas, and Louisiana all passed bills making it a crime to impersonate an election official, or to make it to make information that was not from an election official appear as if it were coming from one. And then a handful of states also passed legislation adjusting or creating new training requirements for election officials and sometimes poll workers. So that can create greater uniformity, greater understanding of the processes that are allowed. It's still early in the 2022 legislative sessions, but I'll add that we are seeing a number of bills seeking to protect election officials now too, to kind of give them additional kind of security options or just make it a crime to harass them, kind of adding them into protected categories. We'll see if any of those pass, and that will be something that NCSL will likely write about. Let's see here. All right, so audits, that term has also come up a lot in conversations about election integrity. And I will clarify that when NCSL and I talk about audits, we mean post-election tabulation audits. All right, so these are the kinds of audits that verify the accuracy of an election's vote tally and have their procedures clearly defined in state law before an election. These also typically take place before election results get certified and become official, so that if any errors are found, they can be fixed before the results get certified. So most states use a traditional audit where the same number of ballots are audited, whether the race was won by a mile or whether the race was a nail biter. But over the last few years, there has been a trend toward risk limiting audits, which is a phrase that made no sense to me the first time I heard it. But these are statistically based audits that decrease the number of ballots that need to be audited, while also providing greater statistical confidence that the election result is correct. So now we see that 15 states either use risk limiting audits, have a pilot program, or make them optional like Ohio does. And those are the 15 states that you can see depicted on this map. Most states that do not have risk limiting audits use the traditional audit and have like 2% of precincts or 2% of ballots from X number of precincts have to be audited. So last year we saw 5 states take legislative action on these post-election audits, and you'll notice this is another area where red and blue states often agree and move in the same direction. So Kentucky and Texas, for example, both established pilot programs for those risk limiting audits. And Nevada, which had established a risk limiting audit piloting program in, I want to say 2019, made a few adjustments to the implementation of its program. Alabama will allow post-election audit of 3 counties in 2022. They don't call it a pilot. I wonder if it is because it seems like a small kind of test. And then in New Hampshire, legislators established a committee to study post-election audit counting devices. So we might see additional action there as well. And you can see that this is kind of happening all across the country. There's no real geographic trend like there is with absentee and mail voting. That tends to be something that gets adopted in the West more so than in the East, largely because the West has states that are more rural, more spread out, where mail voting may be more convenient. Now on to cybersecurity. So election cybersecurity is always important, but despite the emphasis that is placed on it by election officials and other experts, we don't always see a lot of legislation on it. And sometimes that's because a cybersecurity change or improvement might not require legislation. And so we don't see it when we're tracking just bills. But also sometimes election cybersecurity is implicitly affected by other cybersecurity protocols or cybersecurity legislation. So even though you'll see here that only 4 states passed 6 bills on election cybersecurity in 2021, we know that election offices all across the country were taking additional steps to improve the security of their systems. So just quickly, Arizona and Arkansas both require that jurisdictions prevent unauthorized access to election systems. So that can include things like keeping voting machines and e-poll books off of the internet. Arkansas required a legislative study of election systems to assess both security and transparency. Sometimes those things can be at odds. Security and accessibility or transparency are often kind of pitted against each other. It's difficult to find a balance that can work because the most secure system would not be accessible and the most accessible system would not be secure. And then Montana will require state and local election officials to conduct specific security assessments, and Washington exempted election security information from public record requests in order to keep that more contained. And then I have just one more slide on last year's legislation, and I know this was a lot, so hopefully we can dive into things during some Q&A. So just some other hot topics. The first is ranked choice voting, which is when voters rank all the candidates for a given office in order of preference, and then to win, candidates need to receive a majority of votes, not just a plurality. So they need over 50%, not just more than anyone else. There's been increased interest in this voting system from both sides of the aisle. And this year we saw 4 bills pass. They were all 4 pro-RCV bills, and they passed in Colorado, Georgia, Maine, and Utah. Poll workers and watchers were also a hot topic. So we saw about 13 enactments in 11 states. Some of these were relating to training, like I mentioned earlier, but several others were in response to poll worker shortages. So some jurisdictions will now, or some states will now allow poll workers to work in precincts where they're not registered, to serve in adjoining counties, kind of expanding eligibility like that to ensure that kind of all the polls, all the vote centers can have the assistance that they need. And I think we'll see more, especially on the watcher side of that this year. There was also a flurry of enactments on voter list maintenance. So 19 enactments in 14 states. Accurate voter lists are the foundation of an accurate election. And these enactments often included changes to kind of how people got added or removed to those lists, mostly removed. So how decreased people are deceased people are removed from lists. Allowing a state or requiring a state to join ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center, that enables data sharing across states. So if a voter moves from Ohio to Oklahoma, those states will be in contact with each other, and Ohio can know this person is now registered in Oklahoma. We can take them off of our list. So Ohio is a member of ERIC. And also, these bills were making provisions for some voters to keep their registration information private, such as victims of domestic violence. So we saw a couple states doing that last year. So lastly, then, 3 states made significant changes to felon voting rights. Connecticut, New York, and Washington all restored voting rights to citizens on parole, and they were the 19th, 20th, and 21st states to do so. So I know that was a big rundown on what happened in a busy year. I've put my contact information here. So if we can share resources or point you in the right direction, I'm always happy to read and respond to those emails or calls. But really, I'd like to hear from you now and see what questions you might have for me. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can kind of see a little bit better.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was a really excellent kind of view of what is going on around the country in regards to elections and voting. I know that the National Council of State Legislatures is a bipartisan organization, and the League is also strictly nonpartisan. We do not, although we do have positions on issues, we do not take stances on candidates or with political parties. And so I just want to remind everybody with your questions that Mandy will not be able to kind of favor one, she cannot answer questions that will require her to favor one policy over another policy. So Mandy, we're gonna jump into the questions if that's okay. Yeah. I would love for you, I know you talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but if you could tell us more about the National Council of State Legislators, and in particular, your role as a project manager within it. Do you work with state legislators directly, and in what capacity?
That is a great question. Thank you. So I work let me actually step back. So NCSL is governed by a bipartisan group of state legislators. So we alternate between a president who is a Republican and a Democrat every year. It turns over. And so we have kind of equal numbers of both parties represented in our overarching leadership. But our group, we're about 150 people work for NCSL in total, maybe closer to 200 now. Our main office is in Denver. We have a small office in DC that does some congressional lobbying. I don't work with them very closely since we do not lobby very frequently, given our kind of bipartisan nature. So bipartisan structure, we think of our research as purely nonpartisan, and we were formed, I want to say, in the 70s or so. I was not with NCSL when it formed, so I don't always know all this. I've been with the team about a little over 2 years. So I saw that question in the chat. So since the 70s, we have kind of a nice history on our website if you want to go dig and find that. It's kind of cool how this came together. It was a fusion of, I think, about 3 different groups. So within NCSL, we have a bunch of policy teams. There's the elections and redistricting team, there's the criminal justice team, there's the health team. And the elections and redistricting team, which is what I'm part of, is really quite small. There are 4 of us and our director. And I work on the election side and manage our election projects. So we're also purely, almost purely grant funded. So we work with other organizations to produce research that we think will best help state legislators and legislative staff. But we also are a membership organization. So all states pay dues to NCSL and get our services. But if a state doesn't pay dues, we're still available to them. And I think they typically all do pay dues because we're a wonderful resource. So we take their requests. I mean, a legislator reached out to me today and I responded with, some information in an email. If they ask for something that will take a lot more work, we kind of work out a timeline and we do that research for them if it's within our wheelhouse and within our capacity. So any legislator, regardless of state or territory, regardless of party, regardless of tenure, they could have just gotten, sworn in yesterday, or they could be headed out the door in a month, and we will be there to conduct research for them and share our resources. So we do a lot of written work, but we also have regular annual meetings, sometimes virtual, sometimes in person, lots of webinars. And a lot of those things are open to the public. So if you're interested in one of our webinars, you can come.
We'll definitely keep an eye out for that. Thank you. I think it's not something that's widely known amongst people, and that legislators have NCSL and people like you as a resource. So we'll definitely look to share those resources that are open more with our membership. So in your experience, what are the biggest considerations of legislators when there are proposals to change voting and elections law?
That's a really good question too. And I think it varies depending on the state and what the bill is. We have kind of recently created something that we thought could be, or we think could be, a useful tool for legislators and staff, which is almost a rubric for assessing election bills. So 5 different topics that legislators could think about. They might not apply to every bill, but like many of them will apply to many bills. So things like cost, right? How much will a policy like this cost, and where is that money coming from? Politics. So, can I get bipartisan support for this? Is this just something that my party will be happy with, or is it something that I could, get legislators across the aisle happy with this? Election officials. So how does this affect the work of election officials? We often encourage legislators to talk with and get to know their election officials, and many do a really great job building those relationships so they understand how elections work, specifically in their state, because if you know how elections work in Michigan, but you're a legislator in Ohio, it doesn't matter. There's 50+ different election systems. I'm trying to think of the other 2 deliberation points. They're not coming to mind, but we have that election bill rubric. I can even share the link in the chat. And it's not guiding anyone in any one direction. It's just saying these are good things to think about if you're not already. We know that often some of them will come to mind, but maybe you haven't really given a thought to, oh, well, election officials, do they want this or not? Or, how will this affect voters? That was one of the other ones. A big one, right? Will voters be confused by this, right? Sometimes that comes up with things like ranked choice voting. Will they be confused? Do we have to do something else to make this policy change go as smoothly as possible? So those are 4 out of 5 deliberation points that I can remember.
That's great. Thank you. So one of the things I find most interesting about elections is that they vary so much from one state to another, and all over the country, things are quite decentralized in how elections and voting run. And you amazingly follow election and voting policy all over the country. Is there a place or places that is particularly interesting to you?
Oh, do you mean geographically or policy?
Well, I'm policy-wise, policy-wise in terms of voting or elections, is there anything particularly interesting to you in terms of changes, that maybe the mix of voting policies that they have in place? Have they followed certain trends or not?
Well, I will say that, first of all states' policies are interesting to me. I mean, if I had a chance, if I won a bunch of money and could go tour a local election office in every state and every territory, if I couldn't just spend it by like going on vacation or taking a sabbatical for a year, I would love to do something like that, because I learn so much when I'm in the office with the election officials, and things that I didn't even realize, things that I didn't know would be different from Colorado, where I live, right? The election system I know the best just because I've been a voter in it for a long time and have toured offices here because it's easy and it's close. But I learned so much, and that is just fascinating. And I will add too that the processes can vary within county. And sometimes that's, in place in statutes, right? If you have a county that's this small or a county that's this big, you can do things this way, you can do it this other way. And so even just going to one election office in one state doesn't give you the statewide picture. There has been a trend toward more uniformity across states over time, just because it makes kind of training and things like that easier. Makes it perhaps less confusing for voters if you work in one jurisdiction and see a lot of information and then live and vote in another one. But so I would love to do that. In terms of policy areas, I have to say it's mostly just because of the sheer attention on it, but I am really always interested in following what is happening with absentee and mail voting, just because I started at NCSL about 3-4 months before the pandemic. And so I quickly had to learn a lot about those processes. And I'm kind of deep in a research, an update to kind of one of our research reports right now that has about 18 different tables relating to different policies for absentee and mail voting, right? When the ballots need to be received, do you have those cure processes? Kind of how you even verify that the voter is who they say they are on their application or on their ballot, all of that. Absolutely fascinating to me. It doesn't mean I'm an expert though, because I'm just not deep in each single state.
Mandy, I have to take a moment to say you sound like a league member to me. League leaguers are the only people I know who like to hang out at like election offices and attend like BOE public meetings and things like that. We actually have a fairly decentralized elections administration across Ohio, across 88 counties. So it can be interesting to see from one county to another how things are different. But it's appropriate sometimes because the state looks so different from rural to suburban to urban. So thank you for mentioning that. So what does the landscape of elections and voting look like in states where legislatures are relatively bipartisan, if that even exists anymore?
Oh, that's a good question too. I'm afraid I don't have a good kind of mental map of the kind of partisan breakdown of each legislature to know which ones are really close. I mean, you could think about states where the chambers change more, like Virginia or New Hampshire have more recently. But I don't really have a well thought out response to that, just because I'm not the keeper of that partisan composition information.
Thank you. Do you feel like then elections and voting policy has been more partisan across the country?
When people ask me that, just generally, if it feels more partisan to me, I say yes. But I also know people who are, have been in this business longer than me who say, no, it goes in cycles and this is not unique. So while it might feel really contentious or just fraught in some ways now, issues that maybe 5 years ago had bipartisan support, now kind of getting polarized one way or the other. I think there is some truth to those cycles. And so maybe, we're heading into like a waning of it. I'm not in a good position to predict. And anytime I try to predict, I realize that I don't have a crystal ball and don't do a very good job of it, since it's hard.
Well, thank you for your insight. So I'm not sure if this is a question that you can answer, but from among the states that are champion voter access, is there a common thread between them other than the dominant political party? I think that we or people have like it's common to think that blue states head in one way, red states head in another way in terms of wanting greater voter access. Is that true, do you feel, or is there other considerations or other common threads among states that champion voter access?
Well, I think that voter access is important for legislators in all of the states, right? They want voters to be able to access the ballot. Often there are differences in kind of what that might look like and the kind of other considerations on the legislators' plates. I will just say that sometimes I do hear claims about like, well, it's always easier to vote in a blue state or something like that. And that's like, what does that even mean? Easier for who? Easier how? What ways? It's just a little, it's a hard question. So I can say that, there were a lot of comparisons between voting laws in Georgia versus New York, for example. And Georgia has no excuse absentee voting and New York does not. And voters rejected a change to the Constitution to establish no excuse absentee voting in New York. So I don't think it's quite as simple as a party kind of divide on some of these issues.
I appreciate your insight on that, especially the questions of for who and how is voting easier. And those are questions we all need to be asking ourselves as we as we advocate for one voter policy or another, or as we assess them. So I have some more questions from our guests that are attending. At the beginning of the webinar, you had shared some statistics about states that are introducing policy, the number of states that are, how many policies are being introduced and the sharp incline in that, as opposed to the number of enactments. The question about that is, does that data include legislation that limits judicial review of state election laws or ones that target judges in election cases?
So it would include legislation that affects judicial review of election laws, but it doesn't include kind of judicial retention or other kind of judicial information, since that's kind of a separate topic. So anything related to elections and how laws get passed and how elections get run will be in that database. I say that it's also possible sometimes we miss a bill here and there because there are, 3,600 or so. But, that's a part of what we track.
Next question is, how do most states deal with people in nursing homes? They often do not have the required ID.
A wonderful question, and one that reminds me that a project we've been hoping to work on is voting for people in long-term care facilities, which includes those in nursing homes. We kind of have a larger project called Voting for All Americans, and it has a couple different resources created, voting for, let's see here, people experiencing homelessness, voting for people who are military overseas voters, and there's another one out there as well. And so we're hoping to add to it. And those in long-term care facilities is one. I can't say specifically about whether or not they have the ID, but there are just a lot of kind of specific voting issues that come up with that population, right? With, is it okay for someone to come in and help, those people in those facilities vote? How do those ballots get there and get returned? What kind of state do you need to be in to be able to vote? What kind of assistance can you have? So look for that on our website, in the next couple of months. Don't look tomorrow, it won't be there yet. But this is reminding me, there are a couple of web pages that I can drop in the chat, in the kind of Voting for All Americans homepage is one that I will pull up as well. But I could do that while I answer questions.
Thank you so much. And just for our guests to know, this webinar recording will be up on YouTube by tomorrow. And any information that Mandy gives me, we will include in the detailed information, like the description in the YouTube video, so that you can access that all together. And I'll do one more question from our audience. For the ballot, I don't know if you can answer state-specific questions, but for the ballot requests in Texas that are being rejected, is there a remedy for those voters?
Ballot requests that are being rejected. I don't quite know what that means. Is this about ballot measures? I don't think Texas does that, so I don't think I'm following. Some states, about half the states, have a citizen initiative process where voters can pursue a change to state law or the state constitution, or seek to repeal a law that the legislature has passed. That's not the case in Texas. So states that have such processes give voters kind of that direct democracy option. But in the ones that don't, the way is through your legislators.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to ask one more question. By the way, we've gotten a ton of questions, and I'm sorry to our audience that we can't get to all of them. I'm trying to get the questions that are most inclusive, of voting and elections in general. So our last question will be, for those legislators who want to, quote unquote, tighten the act of voting due to concerns about voter fraud, on what evidence of voter fraud do they base their concerns?
So, I think we've all read the news stories where someone, an election official gets a ballot from someone who is deceased, or, a husband and a wife have both sent in their ballots and they signed the wrong one, right? They got mixed up. And so, where do you draw the line on fraud? And so those are kind of just anecdotes that come forward. If you get the ballots mixed up and the state has a signature cure process, it's possible that that gets caught and resolved. But there are always anecdotes of it coming forward. What we do know, are, as much as we can, is that fraud seems to be quite rare. But different security measures have often been discussed, especially with more interest in absentee and mail voting, and kind of the ballot is just less in control of the election official because it's, out of their hands. It goes through the mail, it gets to the voter, it's voted in their home. We don't know what that situation may be like. It can be returned maybe by someone other than the voter. And so I understand why there are, sometimes concerns about that. But at the same time, we see states taking steps to mitigate those concerns. So it's quite a spectrum. Like I said, accessibility and security are often two things that need to be balanced in any voting system.
And it's also, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I added our Voting for All Americans homepage in the chat, and we have a legislation database that has all these bills that I've been talking about that you can look at. And I'll put our kind of main resources page as well, but you can search the NCSL page too. But I have kind of our NCSL elections team resources, and we have a bunch on redistricting on a different page if that's something that you are interested in. So I'm just seeing what I'm putting in the chat, I guess.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you so much for all those resources, Mandy. I'm sure our leaders will find them very helpful, as will I. So I want to close out actually by giving the floor to our president, Iris Meltzer. Hi, Iris, and she would like to close out the webinar and make an announcement. Mandy, thank you again so much for joining us. Amanda, Zoch, everybody from the National Council of State Legislators. And for those of you who need it, this webinar will be up on YouTube by tomorrow. Thank you, Mandy.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, Nazik, for serving as the host of this. And thank you, Amanda, for some amazing information, very helpful and very informative. I have two very brief announcements. The first, I just put into the chat. This coming Thursday, LWVUS Director of Government Affairs, Jessica Jones-Caparel, will be making a presentation virtually through the Akron Roundtable. Her presentation title is Expanding Access and Ending Discrimination, the Current Fight for Voting Rights. So I'm sure many of you have had an opportunity to at least see, if not interact with Jessica. So the registration is free, and actually the link is where you get what you need. The second announcement has to do with the LWVUS convention, which is happening in Denver, June 23rd to 26th. It is being done in hybrid fashion. So you can either go out to Denver for it or, deal with it in the comfort of your own home. And I guess I should have hit enter on that. Sorry. And the link to register for the convention is now in the chat. So you'll have some time to think about that, to figure out how many representatives or voting delegates you have. But the preliminary information is available. And I just realized that I did not put the whole thing in the chat because it shifted pages. So I will redo that. This is why I am not the person in charge of putting things in the chat. There you go. Okay, I think that's it. Again, thank you for some great information, Amanda. I will be checking it out. And thank you, Nazik, for shepherding us through this all-member call.
Thank you so much, Iris. Thanks for being on and for those announcements. That is our board president of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, Iris Meltzer. And with that, we will say thank you and goodbye to everyone. Happy Valentine's Day and happy birthday to everyone on the 102nd birthday of the League of Women Voters. I hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful week.